Good morning. This morning I was asked a question in the name of someone who is a heretic, and the question was, if the Torah was given 3,338 years ago, how come we don't have a Torah from that time? That's a pretty good question, right? So I asked the one asking me, what happened if we would have such a Torah? Would that change the belief of the person asking the question? And so the answer, of course, was no. There are people who ask questions and they just want the question. They don't want to have an answer. And if there is an answer, it won't change their mind. So why go through the charade of the process of the answer? And the answer to that is, Dama shetoshev la'apikeres. Know what to answer to the heretic. The oldest fragments of the Torah have been found to be about 2,000 to maximum 2,100 years. Those are only fragments. The reason why we only have fragments is because the Torah is made on parchment. And parchment is, unlike gold or diamonds, doesn't really last. The oldest fragments we have are from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls only survived because they were placed in clay, in sealed clay pottery, in an environment that was basically free of moisture. The Dead Sea area is one of the hottest and driest areas in the world, if not the driest area in the world, the lowest point on earth, and therefore the manuscripts did not crumble into dust. But let me just say the following. We have texts that go back about 2,000 years. The oldest Torah that we have that's complete is about 800 years, 900 years in Italy. But the fragments of the Torah, from pieces of the Torah, go back at least 2,000 years. And even the so-called biblical scholars, I call them so-called because they're ignoramuses and heretics. They don't want to know the truth. They want to impose their beliefs and their truths upon others. But even according to them, the Torah was supposedly written around the year 500 or 600 before the Common Era, which is at least 1,400 years older than the oldest known Torah, and 500 years older than the oldest fragments that we have of the Torah. So the question is, during that time, how come there are so few deviations in the Torah? In fact, let me just tell you the following. There are communities that have not been connected with the Jewish people for over 2,000 years. The most distinct community that was separated from the Jewish people for that time were the Yemenite community. The Yemenites had very little interaction with Jews in the north and in the west because they were so remote. Their Torah is a tradition for them for at least 2,000 years. Their Torah has 9 letters difference from what is accepted as the Torah among Ashkenazic Jews. Now, let's just think about that for a second. This community was separated from the rest of the Jewish community for 2,000 years. The Torahs that they have are not the originals. These are copies of copies. During that time, it's inevitable that a few errors would have crept in, and therefore what they have for the last few hundred years as their standard Torah has only 9 letters separating them from the Torah that the Ashkenazic world has. To put that into perspective, if you've ever looked at the different variants in the Gospels, there are 30,000 different variations of texts in the Gospels, with many tens of thousands of differences, not just in spelling, but in meaning. Whereas the 9 letters that the Yemenite Torah is different from us does not change the meaning at all. It's like if you write out the word Gadol, great, you can write it out in 3 letters, Gimel, Daled, Lamed, or you can write it out fully, Gimel, Daled, Vav, Lamed. It both means big. So the Yemenite Torah does not change the meaning of the words. Now, we are still a stickler for exactitude in the letters of the Torah. And in order for you to appreciate that, you have to appreciate, number one, that the Torah is a highly specific document where there are no vowels printed or written. And originally there was really no separation of the text. It was a continuous set of letters. That was the text of the Torah, meant to be a strand of DNA of the world, 304,805 letters long. Now, this is hard for us to understand. But just as you have DNA in the human genome, the human being, there's the DNA upon which the world was created, which these are the letters of the Torah. And all that exists in the world was created by these letters, and the combination of those letters, and different ways of substituting letters and exchanging letters along the lines of tradition as we have them by the scholars of the Torah and the scholars of Kabbalah. But all of the creatures of the world have a Jewish name that makes them and has a source within the 5 books of the Torah. And that includes all atomic and subatomic particles, and all galaxies, and all particles of dust, and all areas in space. All have a source within the Torah. It's just that we aren't smart enough to figure out the source. But those who have attempted to go into the source have noticed fascinating things. Number one, Torah words are exact. What appears to be just casual conversation between different parties are in exact number. Conversations between Abraham and Abimelech. Abraham is mentioned 7 times, Abimelech 7 times. Covenant is mentioned 7 times. 7 lambs are mentioned 7 times, and so on and so forth. About 15 or 20 different elements in that small conversation of about 20 verses has about 15 or between 15 and 20 items that are mentioned exactly 7 times. This is not a coincidence. This is very, very highly specific. And there's no way that a scribe in the 6th century before the Common Era would think about those things. Furthermore, it's been shown by computer analysis that many elements of the history of the world are found in a certain order, equal distant letter sequences. And despite the fact that many scoffers try to push this off, those who've examined them, including Mr. Gans, who is he works as a decipher of codes for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, has discovered that the Torah codes offer a consistent system which cannot be debunked by ordinary process of debunking. The possibility of this being planted there is close to zero. So the Torah letters were placed there exactly as they're supposed to be. The fact that we have some differences is because of scribal error. We make copies of the Torah, and it's possible for a scribe to forget a letter or misspell a letter, because some letters look like other letters. But in the course of our history, that there should be so few differences indicate the care that we gave to the source. So now I have to ask all of you the following. Let's make the assumption that the Torah was not a tradition, that this was something that was foisted upon the foolish populations in the 6th century before the Common Era. You mean to say that an entire group of people, called the Jewish people, was so stupid that they would say that this is a tradition that goes back 1,300 years or so, wait, 700 or 800 years. It goes back from Moses' time, and even 300 years before then, that would make it 1,100 years. This goes back to the patriarchs. This really is the Word of God as we got it 1,100 years ago, from Abraham down to Isaac, down to Jacob, down to Joseph, down to all of the descendants that went into Egypt, down to Moses, and so on and so forth. And we're supposed to believe this because now all of a sudden it came on the horizon. You really think that we Jews would have accepted that? We were the most discerning group on earth. We opposed the Babylonians because of the them imposing their beliefs upon us. We opposed the Persians for the same reason, opposed the Greeks for that reason. We're the most independent-minded group of people the world has ever seen. So, if I was there and somebody was telling me this is what you received, and I didn't receive it, I had no tradition, there was no tradition that I could find, would I follow such a thing? The answer is heck no. And neither would anybody else watching this video. There had to have been a tradition that people accepted and knew about in order for that to continue. There's no such thing as a tradition foisted upon people. Christianity does not claim to be the tradition from 1,300 years before Yashka, or 1,400 years before Yashka. They say that there was a tradition, and Yashka came along, and he is the fulfillment of that tradition. But Yashka did not come 1,300 years ago, 1,400 years before. He came 1,400 years later. They admit that. That's when they start their Gospels. Because you cannot claim a tradition that never existed. You can only claim the tradition after it existed. So, if there was a tradition and people went to change it and write it down, they should have said, and they would have said, that we have a tradition, but now we fulfill that tradition by writing it down. We become scribes. And we're different than the previous generations, a bunch of nomads running around not knowing what they were doing. But they didn't do this, and the people accepted this. The only way for them to accept it is if they had a tradition of these scrolls. And it could not have been written in the 6th century because it's all a bunch of baloney, a bunch of ignoramuses. There are rules that of purity and impurity that are discussed in the 10th century stories of King Saul and King David. And that's when those discussions were made. And they were discussing laws that are found in the book of Deuteronomy. So the book of Deuteronomy had to have been there in the 10th century and before. And these laws had to have been well known for them to make those assumptions. There are many such citations, by the way. The people who are much smarter, much more knowledgeable than I have basically destroyed those arguments. But they persist in those arguments. Why do they persist in those arguments? Because They don't want to be told what to do. Mr. Finkelstein, Dr. Finkelstein of Tel Aviv University, who's a complete ignoramus. Why do I say he's an ignoramus? He knows his archaeology. He doesn't know his archaeology. He hates the Jewish religion, and whenever they find an artifact that goes contrary to his desired beliefs, so he revises and he tries to explain away those discoveries in order to fit his mold. And because he is the voice of the opposition to the Jewish religion, so this becomes the consensus. It's not a consensus. There's a few people in Tel Aviv University that they want to decide that the Jewish religion was created in the 6th century before the Common Era, despite the fact that there's overwhelming evidence that it's not true. But this fits into their discourse, that we were a bunch of savages and we were really descendants of the Canaanites, the Phoenicians, and we were just the same as the other Canaanite tribes, and we just deviated and said we were better than the others. And that's why we killed them. This is a very good story for anti-Semites. If the tradition was something that was imposed by the scribes as a tradition that they had from before, there would have been extreme resistance to it. There is no history of that. On the contrary, Josephus reports 2,000 years ago that the people of Israel, 1,900 years ago, the people of Israel continue to behave as if Moses had just died yesterday. In other words, the people believed in the tradition because this tradition was something was handed down from father to son. If it would have been imposed, it would have been just like the gospel, just like Muhammad. Muhammad came along in the year 600. Nobody says Muhammad came before them. What they do try to say is that the Torah that was written for the Jews was really changed by the Jews because the Jews hated Muhammad. They hated the Quran. Of course, the problem with that is that the Torah was translated into Latin in the year 400 and then translated into 300 and translated into Greek approximately 400 before the Common Era, 1,000 years before Muhammad walked this earth. And those traditions are almost exact carbon copy of the Torah that we have. Now, if the Torah had been existent only 200 years, do you really think that there would have been a Ptolemaic king who would have wanted the Jewish translation of their ancient document that's only a couple hundred years old? You got to be silly to believe that. There had to have been a tradition that this was an ancient document for the king of the Greeks, the Ptolemy, who was in Alexandria, for him to want to have a translation. It had to have been an ancient book that was accepted by millions of people as an ancient book, and that's why he wanted the translation in Greek. So that's what I have to say to you, to the people asking the question. No answer is going to work. Even if I could produce a 3,338-year-old Torah, it won't help because they don't want the answer. They just want the question.